Wondering why your relationships aren't getting better, even though you've read a gazillion self help books and subscribed to all the self healing Instagram accounts there are, and yet you still feel so stuck. Your relationship is still emotionally exploding all over the place. You feel lonely, you feel alienated, you're stuck on the heartbreak train. If that's you, and that was me, this bonus episode of the Marriage is Hard podcast platform, the second Therapist Insight, is just for you. As all of you know, I have spoken openly about my traumatizing experiences with therapy and how much damage it did to my own healing journey, how much it set me back, led me on pathways that were just not helpful for my healing. And it wasn't until I finally had a good enough therapist that things started to change. I really started to see some progress, but that was only a good enough therapist. I had to do so much outside work, but it wasn't just reading. As you all know, I put my researcher hat on and I developed my own system for tracking my interactions with my husband, and finally had some answers, because once I could track those interactions and apply a framework to them, I suddenly saw insights into what was happening. But you do not have to do this all by yourself. I had to go by myself because I didn't know where to find the resources. And that's why I love this bonus content, because I go out and I find therapists that are putting out world-class content. Instagram feeds, YouTube channels, authors of books that are just killing it when it comes to putting out frameworks that are likely to be helpful for childhood trauma survivors. But I want to get them on this podcast so that I can, and by extension, you can hear the inside scoop to their experiences. Why do they teach what they teach? How is it important? How does it facilitate healing? So that you get an inside look. People aren't just telling you what to do. They're showing you how it matters towards your own healing journey. So by putting therapists out of their office and out of their comfort zone in a public place in a hot seat, we get all the inside scoop. And that's what I want for you, because I want us to be a community of women supporting women, to be empowered to make the wisest choices for ourselves. And that includes making a wise therapist choice. I'm beyond thrilled to welcome Patrick Teahan to this episode of the Therapist Insight on the Marriage is Hard podcast platform. Patrick is a therapist that offers a 6-month or a 3-year healing from childhood trauma support group. He also runs an outstanding, informative YouTube channel that he literally pours his content creator heart into, with role plays and animated videos of assessments. It truly is something that's going to enhance your awareness about what's going on. And if you're not sure, this is really important for some of you. If you're not sure that you're someone that should be raising your hand to childhood trauma, this episode is especially for you, because Patrick talks about how to think about dysfunction and chaos, what it looks like in a family and a family system. He distinguishes between what's an obvious abusive family, but then what's also a tricky family. And some of you might have grown up in tricky families, or at the very least, your partners grew up in a tricky family, you grew up in an abusive family, and you're trying to make meaning of it together so that you can understand how to create a safe and secure and healthy, deep bonded connection, not over trauma, but over well-being and health. The other thing that Patrick talks about, which I just loved, is this idea of trigger city. So why are some interactions so difficult with your partner, and what you can do to improve them? This is one of the best episodes I've ever produced on this podcast. I am so excited for you to listen. Without any delay, here's Patrick Teahan, content creator, clinical therapist extraordinaire, and someone that's about to drop a lot of knowledge for our wonderful, small but mighty and growing Marriage is Hard listening community. Here it is, ladies.
to make trauma or childhood trauma or family dysfunctional, I think it really needs to be way more universal than people see it. Because in society, it's just looked at, like, well, if you weren't really chained to a basement boiler and fed cat food and viciously attacked as a child, that's the only version of trauma that there is. Yeah. The universality is something that I wanted. So I came up with a questionnaire and I did a video on it. I was just going to put the questionnaire up on YouTube, or have it to be, and that questionnaire was inspired by a guy named John Bradshaw, who wrote Homecoming, which is an inner childhood trauma. And I wanted to come up with just basically a reference point for people. And that questionnaire was questions like, I tend to get through things rather than be present for them, like the holidays or a date or shopping. That's that I look at that as a symptom of the person not being present in their body, or being exhausted about what could go wrong, as a potentially about being present for it. So the questionnaire and the video that I put up, it just, I put it up. I learned how to animate software. The video took a month to put together, and I was just in this project. And then I put it up on YouTube and nothing happened. Nothing happened, and it was just like one of my other videos. It was like, well, I learned a lot. That was neat, and then a year later it got shared somewhere, Facebook, Reddit, or something like that. And then it just started to take off. And then people just started to really resonate with it. People started to I scored really high on this thing. What does it mean? The questionnaire itself was just to get to people. It wasn't a definitive diagnosis of childhood PTSD.
In marriage, and it sounds like you are married, so you have some experience with how this plays out.
I'm kind of fascinated by it. We're the hardest on our partner. When it comes to intimacy. It's different than our kids or our bosses or our siblings or something like that. Most of the upset tends to go on our partner, or we can call it the projection, or our well of stuff that comes up.
Yeah.
So, and then I was reading one of my favorite books, one of my favorite old school clinicians, Carl Jung. And I was reading Memory, Genes, and Reflections again for the second time in my life. And what blows my mind is he's a really important person, I think, in the history of inner child work or parts work, because, he lost his wife and was feeling lost in the world. And he started building models. He made a little castle from little pebbles that he picked up by a beach in Switzerland. And he made himself a little house. He was a very creative person. Yeah. And he was playing. And he realized that there was a part of him that was processing the death of his wife through playing.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was saying, and this is 100 years ago, somewhere in his writings, he said, marriages are mostly about trying to control our partner to be who we think they should be. That was 100 years ago.
I don't think that's in most people's wedding vows.
No, no, it should be. Yes, I'll try not to.
That'd be like the honest wedding.
Right. You eat too much junk food. Why are you eating so much junk food? And it comes out in those sort of ways. Related to that is when we grow up in a dysfunctional family system or toxicity, not in safety.
Yeah.
We're trying to fix our childhood through our partner.
Yeah.
And whether that is, I think a lot of that is trying to get our partner to wake up to be available to us.
Yeah.
The other piece is that we tend to pick people who are unconscious, like our parents. So that where it's a little bit of I'm a little bit scattered, but it's a hard thing to articulate. But I've been in private practice and or been doing this sort of work on myself since around 1996. And what I know now is what I'm fascinated about is there are just mechanics to this stuff that is literally like if a mechanic went into a car, they would be like, oh, the carburetor is bad. And that's why the thing affects it like this way. Childhood trauma is like that as well. You grow up with a certain type of childhood. I did an intake earlier and someone was describing their present problems. And I just basically said, it just sounds like you're behaving in a way that like you were grown up in chaos and neglect. And the person was like, how did you know that? And it's not like I'm guessing somebody's weight at the circus. There's nothing really special about it. There's these just predictable things.
Yeah.
Especially with the marriage stuff. So
Patrick, I want to back up. I want to ask two clarifying questions.
Yeah.
So for when you say chaos and dysfunction,
Mhm.
I think I know what you mean, but like, let's just be really like, so what does that look like when you're saying, if this is you,
Yeah.
this is how you sort of can raise your hand and not doubt yourself raising your hand? Because I think there's a lot of people, especially with emotional abuse and neglect,
Mm.
if they weren't hit or they weren't sexually abused, they feel very uncomfortable raising their hand, which is like one of the symptoms of what they experience. So like it's
Yeah.
complicated. Let's just be clear. Who are you talking about?
Chaos, it can mean many different things,
Okay.
but chaos and neglect, a person said that they were a latchkey kid. And that's just like there was no physical abuse, there was
Mm-hmm.
no sexual abuse. There's just the emotional childhood neglect of getting themselves up in the morning, getting themselves lunch ready. You know, the parents don't come home till 9 p.m. and it's like 1978.
Yeah.
And there's really no connection. Maybe that parent is in survival mode. That's one version of it. My case of neglect and chaos was growing up in alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
The neglect was more emotional neglect. On a Tuesday, my mom would be amazing and be sober. On a
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday through Friday, she'd be an MIA. On Saturday, so chaos and neglect is sort of, there's a lot of inconsistency.
Yeah.
So there's just different qualities sort of to it. Never know when we're going to get, but it's where when you talk about the mirroring is in some ways that in some childhoods, there's just this kind of dull thud sadness of no one being around,
Mm-hmm.
of latchkey kids not knowing whether to answer the door or not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like kids not knowing who's going to sign the field trip
Yeah.
signature, and being just overwhelmed by basic things. There's been plenty of times in my own childhood of like hat day in the third grade about, people don't really realize how much pressure is on neglected kids in a way that, I think in the third grade, the teacher might have said, we're going to do crazy hat day at the end of the month on this day. Here's the handout. Tell your
Yeah.
mom, right? And
Yeah.
sort of, it went in my bag, and just forgotten about. Teacher said, see you guys tomorrow, a month later for crazy hat day. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like normal childhood stuff. Every kid would be like, what? Sure. Put it in a handout. So I think what I'm getting at is with the chaos and neglect is every kid needs a really safe home base with eyes on them.
Yeah.
And when you don't get that, there's many layers of what could go wrong,
Yeah.
that causes overwhelming feelings in the child, stressful feelings, and a lot of shame-based feelings in the child.
And then it seems like there's another layer then of when you do need help and you try to seek that help from your parent, right?
Yep.
That it often isn't met with the kind of help that would be expected or beneficial to the child.
Yes. And maybe to circle back to marriages is that when the kid survives that, and they're now in a partnership, is the triggering. It's actually, triggering is a tricky business, but it helps us see the ways that we have unfinished business to do. Like, in other words, with that neglect and chaos, the person coming out of that system might really need to know what their partner, you know what I mean? Like that. And the partner might casually say, like, on a Thursday, they might say, oh, Jim and Sandy invited us over for dinner tomorrow night, just FYI. The person gets massively, what? You didn't tell me that. What the fuck? Like, just like sort of like, this is kind of stuff that comes up in marriage. And the partner is confused. Like, it's just sort of like, I'm telling you now, they just brought it up, and it was just off the cuff, but for that person that grew up in neglect and chaos, their strategy might've been control.
Yeah.
To survive that neglect and chaos. And that's where it gets wonky in a partnership.
Yeah. Yeah. That control piece it's not good for marriage. And, speaking to more and more childhood trauma survivors, it is one of the ways that you would try to adapt to try in your adult life to try to control every single aspect of your life.
Right.
And your partner.
Right.
And they don't like good, healthy partners. They don't like that so much.
Yes. Right. Right. But what I find is the good, healthy partner is they're kind of rare.
Oh,
and what
okay.
I find is that, let's just say in that example that I just gave, like, why didn't you tell me?
Right.
Is partner who's talking about in the invitation, now all of a sudden to the other partner's inner child, they are irresponsible, thoughtless, oblivious, kind of a loose cannon. And then all the childhood stuff goes on that partner. And then it's like a 2-hour roundabout conversation in the car about, I don't get this. Why didn't you tell me? I don't get why you can't just validate my feelings. I have the right to be upset that you didn't tell me. And then the partner is just sort of like, if their childhood was one that they were always in trouble, forget it. Because you can see how that is like a yin yang symbol of replicating it, like, yeah, you're in trouble with me.
Yeah.
And then overwhelmed. I'm confused. Should I have told you? Am I bad? I guess I'm bad. I just want this end to end. So I guess I'm an asshole. That's what I mean about the predictable patterns of it. If anyone relates to that, or if I'm naming your exact dynamic for the listener, it's not just you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of relief in that.
So what are some of the most common, like in your clinical practice that you've seen, what are some of the common projections or like these dynamics that you see that are pretty, I wouldn't say universal, but are really recognizable for trauma survivors, whether it's one or both partners?
Sure. Great question. I think in a general way, if you picture one person's energy going up, they're usually paired with someone who goes down. So they're a person who is a fighter, fight, flight, freeze, submit, shame, cry for help. There's sort of two more. For someone who's the fighter, who tends to go into lawyer mode in the hypothetical that I just gave, why didn't you tell me? Controlling, reactive, really hard on their partner. They're a fighter. Yeah. They're fighting about trust. They're usually paired with, there's just a generalized pattern is that one person can really go up with big energy, and that tends to shut the person down more. That was my wife and I at the beginning of a relationship. I was a really good fighter and hard on her in some ways. And then she would cry silently, constricted crying. That was our childhoods playing out in that way, and then when she started to do work, she started to take me on more. Yeah. And then, so there's a balance. There's the couples, they have a lot of really great work to do in that. So I'm generalizing, but one person going up, one person going down is a usual pairing. Okay. That the person who goes up and goes into lawyer mode looks like an asshole, to be blunt. Yep. Yeah. And then the person who shuts down looks like a victim, to be blunt. Yeah. When it takes just as much adrenaline and trauma response to put them both in that place. So it's kind of like it's dangerous for us to look at it totally from a morally viewpoint. If we were watching that on a GoPro in that car in that argument, we would just be like, give him a break, shut up, or whatever. But some of us might be like, whether, and not to be gender specific in this, it could be vice versa or whoever. Yeah. But we might also want that person who's shutting down to stand up for themselves more. Yeah. And that's kind of exactly what needs to sort of happen to change the dynamic. That's a general. One person goes up, one person goes down. They can vacillate. One thing that's really hard is high conflict. They both go up. That this tends to be too much rare, or kind of on the rare side, because couples don't really last that long if they're so volatile, or it just doesn't, in my mind, it just doesn't really tend to work. Yeah. That was my first marriage. It didn't work. It definitely didn't work. It's very hard. It's really hard. I mean, it's all hard, but yes, because it's like, there's no foothold. It doesn't seem to get space. Right. To back up a little bit, my wife and I, we've done a lot of work. We did a couples group, and thank God for it. Because like many marriages, we may have not have made it at certain times. I think, especially when the couplehood has small children. Yep. Most stressful transition to parenthood. All the research shows it's like the most stressful event for couples. Many layers to it. As a side note too, I think when we get married, the triggering gets deeper, because now our partner, I think we go from being lover to relationship. When we get married, I think it takes it up a notch into a place of you're now family. And there may be a new triggering minefield to navigate in that. Yeah. I think too, a lot of people, I can speak for myself, you think the problems are going to go away because you've probably had individual problems navigating your family, navigating other relationships. Sure. And this is your chance for like this person, the savior, to come in and like it all goes away. Yes. Right. Or even simply like, I made it. I didn't have the childhood that, I didn't have the marriage that my parents had or something like that.
Yeah. And now here I get my second chance.
Yep.
I mean, that runs so deep. I even thought with like a take two marriage and my like remarriage, it would all go away.
Right.
It didn't. Okay. So you all got married.
A couple of funny stories. So before we got married, we were living together right outside of Boston. And I grew up in a chaotic alcoholic environment. So in my young adulthood I tended to sort of have my ducks in the row. I tended to be, not super neurotic, but I liked I liked organization and planning.
Yep.
Because I grew up without it. So we move in together and I go to the hardware store in the new apartment and I get 3 or 4 sets of keys. One for the rock in front of the apartment building that if we lost our keys, you could go into the plastic rock and get it. Yeah. One for her, one for me, one for one spare somewhere. And then my wife had a friend stay with us for a week. And it was one of those things where I was not, she had a group of friends that would just do that around, and she would just, the beginning triggering would be like, oh, my friend Jane's coming for 2 weeks. Just wanted to let you know, and she'll be here in an hour. So those bums trying to work out, and like, it's just basically, my wife wasn't bad in that. It was just like, young adults really have to get used to what sort of, how we don't know we affect our partner as much as we do.
Yep.
Anyway, the friend gets the spare set of keys from the rock outside.
Okay.
And you can see where this is going. She gives the spare, the friend takes off with the keys after the visits because she's human. And then I never forget my keys. And I was interning at the VA in my first year of my master's program. And it was like an ice storm. And I go home, I'm away, and I'm like burnt out from all the reading of sort of psych reading and my internship and stuff like that. And I just like was sort of probably triggered at baseline just from that or whatever.
Yeah.
And I forget my keys. And, it's just an example where how I spoke to her on the phone was really ugly because I'm triggered.
Yeah.
I'm triggered back to, my mom or my dad, that I would do stuff to make our family life better and they would not see it or care about it and then sabotage it.
Yeah.
So I'm outside of my apartment in an ice storm without any keys. And when I call my wife, I trigger her by sort of saying like, hey, just in that tone, you know what I mean? Like, hey, I probably did the friend walk away with the keys and just be, and triggered her. And how I triggered her was she was sort of like, yes. And what do you want me to do about it?
Afraid to be in trouble.
She's in trouble and I'm bullshit.
Yeah.
So where coming back to, I know it's like we're on a podcast.
So how did that resolve?
We did some work around it, but my point is it's a really good example in my own marriage about me projecting onto her.
Yeah.
And also my wife projecting onto me because now she's in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And she has to defend herself. All I needed for her to say is like, babe, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. You know what I mean? Can you maybe go to a coffee shop and I'll get there as fast as I can. I'm so sorry. I feel bad because you did all the,
yeah, you got all the keys. You were trying to keep us like, you had plan C and D and like my friend just took off. Like,
but we can't do that because of our brain structures and physiology and adrenaline when we're triggered.
I wish we could.
I know, but it's just like it's like, there's a really powerful thing that for the person who becomes self-righteous, they become more self-righteous if their partner shuts down.
Mm.
It's almost like this, like, look at me when I'm talking to you kind of energy.
Yeah.
Because they just interpret their partner trying to get out of trouble rather than having any ownership of it. So for many trauma survivors is if they are having a problem with someone and the person has zero interest in owning any part of it, trigger city.
Yeah.
Trigger city. So how we got out of it is we had to really kind of like work on that one in a way that we probably did an intimacy tool called the 1, 2, 3. I was triggered. You were triggered. Here's how you're not like my mom.
Mm.
It's just, you just made a mistake or whatever, or I got triggered to someone really being irresponsible and not giving a crap
Yeah.
about me or my efforts.
Right.
You know? And then she got triggered to someone being really hard on her for things out of her control, which is in both of her story and, so when a bump like that comes up between people, who they are, they're no longer who they are. They're dealing with their parents now.
And that is so important. So like, say that again for people.
What'd I say?
You said you're not yourself in those moments.
Yeah. Like my wife wasn't my wife, who was sort of lovely, who I love dearly, who I wanted to build a life with, who was human, who was just whatever. Mm-hmm. She was just now all of a sudden someone who really willingly didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And that's my mother.
Yeah.
My mother is somebody who's a very sick person who my mom feels like she's going to die if she owns anything.
Yep.
Because she's so aggressively shame-based. No, I didn't. That wasn't true. Wasn't that bad? Yeah. So I was dealing with I was so triggered. My body was remembering mom, and I was no longer seeing my wife.
Yeah.
Same thing, just in a nanosecond. When I'm upset with her around those times, what I love about it now is I don't really get upset like the way I used to. And like my wife has done enough work right now. She can kind of like meet me halfway and take me on or whatever, speak up for herself or whatever. So we both helped each other grow up in that. I became one of her parents because she had a childhood that was just like, really asked to perform beyond her age. Really demanded that she become a little adult and be overly responsible for things
that she couldn't control.
Nope. Right.
Yeah.
And then there's nothing worse than having a parent lose it on you for things that you aren't really responsible for. It's not your job, So there was that's one example. Another example is something I call credit card gate. From our marriage where as most people in our 20s, we were in credit card debt. I had gotten out of credit card debt at one point.
Yeah.
And, we were working on our credit card debt together. And for the course of 6 months, a conversation went like this. My wife would be like, oh, all this credit card debt. And I would say, well, babe, why don't you open up another card, 0 interest, and do the 18th month thing, spend it down, and then you can get a leg up on it. And she would say, I don't want to mess up my credit. And I'd be like, well, you would be building credit. If you take out another card, it's like you don't have so many cards. I don't want to. Okay. 3 months later, the same conversation. I don't know, I don't want to. And I'd be like, what's wrong with you? This is just simple. You know what I mean? It's like, fine, okay, but just stop complaining about it then, And then we go to visit her dad, and the same conversation comes up. And her dad was a great guy, and we're on his porch. And he's just like, he's meeting me for the first time. And throughout that visit, we were just talking about our life as young people. And we're talking about buying a house, debt, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the same conversation comes up, and she's like, yeah, we just have all this credit card debt. And he says, well, you could just take out a 0% interest. 18 months, you just do it over there. And she just goes, what a great idea. And it's and in a similar way to the prior example, that one's just more funny. But then I would be triggered to, as a child, it probably made me a good therapist, but I was my mom's therapist or caretaker.
Yeah.
So, but my mother was also a help rejecter, meaning that, Mom, why don't you try this? Why don't you try this? Why don't you blah, 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 blah. Sounds good. I'm not going to do it though.
Yeah.
So it's a situation from my childhood about offering solutions to someone who doesn't take those solutions out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's really specific because remember, my wife is kind of like, I don't want to mess up my credit because she was triggered about that. But interesting, again, it's she could hear it from another outside person, but she couldn't hear it from her partner. And that's what I mean about this partner stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like what's really fascinating is that a lot of people for a long time will think, well, this is just the way I am. This is me. I don't get along well, or I tend to, come out strong or alienate people or shut down my partner. And they don't separate that like you just did in your stories from, this is my response to this and this is who I am.
Right.
And when you're a trauma survivor, those are really off. you know yourself to be what you hope is a good, peaceful, loving, compassionate person. You don't seem to be able to do that when it matters most. And then that fills you with shame because you're like, at some level, when you come down off the trigger, you recognize sort of what you did, like, like that nasty tone of voice or,
So true. Yeah.
slamming something or bullying your partner. And then you're like, who does that? And when you don't have the puzzle piece, who does that is someone who survived childhood trauma. The only answer you have is someone who's a bad person like me.
Yes. Right. Where it's such a great thing you just said is a couple things is when someone is seeking trauma work from me, they don't really know what to expect. And I really tell them up front, we're going to talk about mom and dad and what it was like a lot, even if you don't remember. Your body remembers, but exactly what you just said. We freak out on our partner because we just had that energy and that drive to do so, self-righteous energy or something like that, not fully understanding it, not knowing where it comes from. Like the stuff, I call it atonement. Atonement meaning you hurt me and now you must atone for those sins.
Oh, yes. That sounds familiar.
Weird word. I'm sorry to throw it out there, but I just mean or in other words, almost like an economic way. It's like you owe me.
Yeah.
And coming back to the person who goes up, the person who goes down, the person goes up is usually saying, how dare you? You own me. The person who goes down because of their child is saying, I think you're right. I must be awful. I do owe you. Coming back to when I sort of say, we're going to talk about, I want to know your family history and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about that. They may kind of say like, well, why does it have to be really about that? I just want to know how to change. And in other words, I would say to them, we can't get you to change unless we know why you do the things a certain way. So those two examples that I recounted is I had to spend time in therapy is when that credit card gate or the key thing comes up to ask, why am I so upset about this? Specifically, what does this take me back to?
Yeah.
And then I happen to be a person who remembers my childhood. So, and you don't necessarily have to, the goal isn't about getting those memories back. We can kind of do it in a little bit of like generalized forensics. Okay. Narcissistic parent, you know what I mean? Alcoholic parent. We have a baseline.
Yeah.
But to ask those questions, what does this take me back to? People have to spend, I would say, a good amount of time. I spent 3 years in a group therapy doing individual work as well, thinking about what does it take me back to? Getting my brain to shift into frontal lobes, which is more thinking and feeling at the same time, as opposed to the trauma brain to say like, okay, what does it take me back to? All the times my mom never made a promise. All the times that my mom said she would take me to the store, but then she would only leave the house 5 minutes before the store closes because she had magical thinking about the space-time continuum.
Yeah.
She was an alcoholic. And then I could watch that mess show play out. And then we get to the store and I can't get the thing that I need for school.
Right. And you're going to show up with the one kid who doesn't have it.
Sure. So all of those thinking about what does it take me back to is the name of the game. To recognize there's a big difference between my wife just being human about a house key than my narrative in my head that she willingly doesn't give a crap and is being defiant. And it's almost like an insult, self-righteousness. How dare you?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can be in this relationship. If anyone, when you mentioned raise the hand kind of stuff like that, 99% of my clients are in that world. And it's so much more common than we think. So to take the heat off ourselves, we are responsible for it. Because to be blunt, I'm a jerk with my wife on the phone, making her feel bad. That's what's going on in the present.
Right.
That's what's really going on in the present. But the other piece is to know what it takes me back to and hold my parents accountable for it.
Yeah.
Incidentally, like how I treated my wife in that moment is how my mother taught me to treat people when they disappointed you.
I was about to say, like, it's so complicated because
right? Right. You disappoint me. You don't show up for me. I'm going to rage. I'm going to be reactive. I'm going to shame you until you're a puddle of crying on the ground.
Yep.
And I learned that from the masters. So there's another piece about, I think that for everybody, we have to really look at what do we really take a look back and think about? do we value that behavior? Because the inner child will be like, yeah, we do. They did that on purpose, so I'm going to make them feel bad. But the adult part of us needs to sort of say, coming back when you said earlier about like, I went into like DEFCON 5 mode and I don't know how I got there. Now I have a shame attack afterward, which is another common pattern.
Yeah.
I did that. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. We learn that.
So you said 3 years. And so these are long journeys. I mean, not a lifetime, but it's a process. So anyone who's listening, who's like, wants to flip a switch and just get rid of this, like, we hear you. Like, I wish there was a switch.
Totally.
But it's a multi-year process. And it starts with, I think what you said, which is just like that seed of awareness that you're responding to whatever it is in front of you, not as it is, but to something that's not what it is, but your mind has tricked you into thinking it is.
Yeah. I did most of that work in a group.
Mm-hmm.
That was a 3.5-year group from like 97 till right around pre 9/11.
Okay.
And then I did a couples group with my wife with her for a year, and then a present focus group, which is present more like sort of manifesting what you want from life. That was another 3 years. Sporadic individuals sort of around it, 12-step recovery, all the way sort of through it. So it's a long process, but for people in our world these days, people are very transient and people want fast. It's just the way our society is right now. They want they want kind of a meme on Instagram to hit them, but then they quickly forget it because we're scrolling, Right. I tell people that, unfortunately, I'm not trying to be crass, but it took us about 20 years to become really dysfunctional and develop and get caught in those ways. It's going to take some time to kind of get out of it.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty upfront with that. You know what I mean? Just like when I do a 6-month childhood trauma group and I do a 3.5-year childhood trauma group. Mm-hmm. And the 6-month one is an introduction.
Yeah.
To get people to sort of break some denial and to really ask themselves, was it really that bad? That's the goal of that first group.
That's important. That's what I was saying. Like, people don't know how to raise their hand or like start doubting themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's where I would want, if anything, influence from my channel or my work is even if they're not my client, to get a sense about like I see you.
Yeah. I actually just wrote that on a comment on one of your videos. I'm like, I feel so seen.
Cool. Well, cool. Because I really wish that as a society, we start really looking at the parenting. I delete a lot of comments on my YouTube channel because you get a lot of comments that are just like, what a bunch of snowflake liberal, blah, blah, blah. Parents did the best they could. Yeah. And like, I'm not trying to attack that level of culture or politics or whatever, but I think for millennia I think people mistake abuse for being victimized or being weak.
Yeah.
And I would really love to see that change. And for people who are listening is, it's rare that the family is functional. It's rare that the family is healthy. If you had a good enough mom and you felt safe and you had a safe home base, that's a golden unicorn kind of experience. And I'm really glad that person had it.
Yeah.
But for everybody else, I think we need to stop pretending that wasn't that bad, because wasn't that bad is actually what kept us sort of alive through it. But it's interesting. When we were all 12, we knew on some level. Yeah. We knew when we would go to the Boy Scouts. And we would we knew when we would go to our friend's house. Yeah. We knew when you would have dinner at a friend's house and there wasn't like eye rolling or intense grumpiness or just basically like someone crying when they were playing Monopoly. All of however it went down,
Yeah. That makes me want to cry. Yeah. But yeah. I think that's powerful. No matter where you're coming from, if you've really fucked up so far with your parenting, with your partnership, always a chance, take the step forward to be like, I don't want to repeat this. I don't want this for me. And it doesn't happen overnight. And even if you've done things that you're really not proud of, there's hope for you. Like you can do better with the right support.
Right. And I think that the right support, I'm so glad you said that, is I really think the word accountability comes up, and not in the way we think it is. You know what I mean? And accountability for, I guess what I'm saying is that when we have those parental fails, is somebody taught us how to do that.
Yeah.
You know, that and accountability on the upper generation, because for millennia, human species are just basically sort of like, look, I'm doing a better job than my parents did, so whatever.
Yeah.
But looking at the accountability of, we were set up to behave this way. We were set up to really, really get triggered. It's not something we would choose.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If we had a flux capacitor in a time machine and went back to like 1994 and it was like, hey, Patrick, do you want to be screaming at your girlfriend about a couple of keys and really become sort of emotionally like passive aggressive and abusive at her in a couple of years? Do you want that? I wouldn't have chosen that. Unless we do our work, it's inevitable that we have shades of our parents. Or I think our biggest fear as a human, if we grew up in dysfunction, is becoming one or both of them or whatever, you know? And I absorbed things from my mother, but I also rejected things from my mother. I absorbed things from my dad and I objected things from my dad. So mirroring and modeling is where the accountability is. If you were a client and that situation with your daughter had just happened, I just would have sort of, been there for you and really sort of said, make sure you say you're sorry. I'm sure you've already done that. It's, you're showing healthy remorse because of that, but then I would put your parents in an empty chair and I would say, can you tell them about how they parented? Can you tell them what they taught you? It's different than passing the buck, because it's including that my mom, my dad taught me to really isolate from people. Mm-hmm. My dad really kind of said, be a lone wolf. Don't, marriage will weigh you down. People will weigh you down, but that's like my dad's trauma legacy. And my mom taught me how to be reactive. My mom taught me how to shame people. One of a universal thing that we can't, my mentor says that you can't learn anything if you're full of shame. You can't, if the person tells me that they did something wrong and they spend the session telling me I'm a terrible person. Yeah. They can't hear the learning in it. They can't hear the way out of it, Yeah.
So. How do you cope with that? Because it's also really sad. Like it forces you to let go of your parents in a way that is also really scary when you actually start doing that honestly and start really holding them accountable.
Yeah, right. It's a long process, because at the beginning of it is, clients don't like it when I talk critically of their parents.
Yeah.
Some people, they are at a different place and they welcome.
They're ready.
They're ready, or they're welcome that. And, one exercise, one trick around it is, my mentor says this, is sort of write down all the nasty things that you want to say to your partner. Mm-hmm. How dare you? You were late for 45 minutes after I had told you about my trauma 2 days before. You don't get it. You don't give a shit. And another thing, you're eating too much junk food and clickety clack, just type it out. And then I have the person take a highlighter out and say, could you say the same thing to your parents? Oh, how dare you? Even after I said that I was scared and afraid, you did it anyway.
Yeah.
Boom, 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 boom. Atonement. I miss it, but because of the virus, I can't have clients do rage work. And I rent space across the street from me, and we take a little field trip, and it's a soundproof room where the person can rage at a bag. And then I'm coaching them. And it doesn't even have to be about somebody else. It's sort of like a client who struggles with workaholism. Yeah. And they're addicted to the relationship with their boss, or what their boss thinks of them, or all that kind of stuff. And their world gets really sad and really small.
Yeah.
and their health deteriorates or whatever. So having them hit the bag about how they were set up to think that that's how you get love in the world, or
Yeah.
how you were set up to think about how that's what kept you okay.
Yeah. If you
Right,
perform, if you're
right,
valuable.
right. And literally, it's there's always in the room of people going, "Is this passing the buck?" But I may kind of say, "Can you hit the bag and say, you're the reason why I'm 47 years old and I don't have a partner?"
Yeah.
Like that's big.
Yeah.
That's really, really big. So in some ways, I'm trying to get people to sort of do that so they can find a partner. So they
Yeah.
can recognize that like the the relationship between coping and keeping our world small is really off, or it no longer works. I no longer want to like live this way. I no longer work 75 hours a week
Yeah.
to, yes, get accolades that I'm doing a good job, but it doesn't hit where I need it to hit. The workaholism at 70, it's sort of like where it sounds like I'm a drill sergeant, but when people start to do work with me, I might sort of say to them, my job is to ruin your tolerance for how you normally do business. So in other words, your workaholism is going to, in some ways when it's not that bad because they don't really think about how bad the workaholism is.
Yeah.
But in talking about it, I'm ruining your tolerance for having the alcoholic partner and you need to get out of it, for
Yeah.
having a workaholism thing in your life, for being really, even for the person who really hates aspects of their family system, but they call their mother every other day. I'm ruining their tolerance of it. How did it make you feel when you said, Mom, you got to see the pictures of the 3-year-old, what she just did, and then Mom just talked about herself? How did that feel?
Yeah.
So ruining that tolerance, and the coping or the magical thinking keeps our world really small. So trying to get somebody to say like, I don't want this anymore. This doesn't work for me.
Yeah. That is, I think a lot of trauma survivors that haven't really started their healing journey, their worlds do feel very small, and they are small kind of by design, or like by survival mode that keeps it small for them. So that's gold.
Right.
What you just said, ruining the tolerance, it kind of for the ways you survived that no longer cut it
Right.
anymore.
And for the person listening, is there was a process to trauma work. Hell or high water, I think you have to build a relationship with a therapist. A guy named Yalom came up with the premise of group therapy. He's a wonderful writer, and he just basically says, sometimes it's not about the model, it's about the relationship that comes first.
Yeah.
So building a connection with a therapist or a group in a good enough way,
Okay.
is amazing. If you can't afford therapy, go to Al-Anon.
Okay.
Go to CODA. You don't have to have an alcoholic or a codependent or something in your life, but those two 12-step programs are rooted in the dysfunctional family system, and you'll learn a lot, and it's free.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's social, and that's the thing that we usually don't want.
Yeah.
And also it's a great time because Zoom right now is you're safer in Zoom than you would be going into the church basement and talking about your narcissistic dad
Yeah.
or your
Yeah.
alcoholic grandfather or something like that. Codependence Anonymous or ACOA, they talk about genograms.
Okay.
They talk about, so there's a bunch of free resources that are readily available to people. YouTube education is wonderful, but awareness doesn't change your inner child.
Right. So if you're basically you're saying if you're just like kind of scrolling through Instagram, hitting YouTube, that's like might help you feel seen and like validated, but that is not healing.
I don't want people to think that they're on a healing journey because they've been journaling and looking at narcissism videos for 4 years.
Okay.
You technically are on a healing journey.
Right.
But can you handle your projection and triggers with a partner?
Mm-hmm.
Can you really develop intimacy with a friendship? Can you really develop intimacy with yourself and your inner child? Trauma is about the disconnection from self and others.
Right. That's really important to remember.
And you can't heal your trauma by reading self-help books. And to the listener out there, I know you've read a lot of them.
Tons of them.
I know you've read a lot of them. Sometimes you've read them twice. They're wonderful. I love them. I use them as handouts in my group, but it can't be just that because you'll stay the same.
Yeah. And the same's not good enough for you. You deserve more.
Wherever you're at on this, listening to this podcast, it's just simply where you're at. Some people come to me, some people are like, I might have been bad. I know my dad was bad, but I saw your video. So it's just, that's perfectly natural and fine for wherever you sort of start in this kind of stuff. Some people, and I really want to make this a point known, it's easier if you come from an undeniable abusive mess of a family system. It's easier for you to do your work. Mm-hmm. When you come from a system where you feel more for your parents than yourself, trauma work is harder. Unfortunately, you're just burdened with an additional step. Mm-hmm. So if there was just blatant stuff and you had to leave, if you had to emancipate yourself at 15 years old and get out of that family system and you didn't look back, good for you. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. But for that person who really had to stay in it and is still struggling with, but my dad was so bad to my mom and it's not my mom's fault and that kind of thing, like that it just sort of takes, you have an additional burden. Yeah. And it's harder in that way. It's just the difference between a blatant family and a tricky family. The symptoms are exactly the same. No one can do intimacy. People are really, really hard on themselves. For that person that really feels like they can't talk about their parent in a negative light, it's just trickier. It's just harder. Yeah. A little bit. It's an additional layer of pain. I think it's a human being's purpose and legacy, I think, or a big chunk of it, is to reclaim intimacy and do our work with our partner. And because I find that whether it's coming back to the self-help thing, it can't be done in a vacuum. It just doesn't really kind of work. It just doesn't really kind of work that way. One other piece is I want to also to really recognize to the listener out there is that, and this is in Gottman. Gottman talks about this, of trying to get somebody it's very difficult to do our work with our partner if that partner is incredibly guarded or really feels like there's nothing wrong with their family system or they don't have any stuff or anything like that. And it's sort of a very complicated, bad situation, because for the trauma survivor, it's like a re-traumatizing event that, nope, guess what? It's you. Yeah. So for that person out there I don't mean to be mean, but I might get a call from somebody and says, you sound amazing. I would love for you to see my husband. I think you would be amazing with him. Great fit. And I'm just sort of like, I'm sorry. Have your husband call me then. Oh, he's not going to call you though. And I just want to really for that person out there I really feel for you in that. For that person who is out there who's struggling with their own trauma, and their partner is just basically like, that's you. I don't, you know what I mean? And it's clearly not. It's just like, that's just kind of a hard, lonely place to be in. Yeah. And part of that person's journey is going to be about somehow coming to terms with that relationship. Yeah. Because it's just such a not being seen. And I think I knew my wife was safe when I told her my story in that first couple dating, sort of the beginnings of fall in love. When I told her my story, she didn't say, but she's your mom. Mm-hmm. She didn't say, but what are you going to do? My wife just kind of like, and I want people in my group work to get this from other people, from other group members, or to get this from me, is my wife was just kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe you survived that. Yeah. So if you're on a date, listener, and you get that person where you're like, well, yeah, like, like date number, hopefully you don't share that till date number 5 or 6 until you see the person safe or whatever. Yeah. And if you get that response of like, oh, that's kind of weird, my mom's not like that at all, run. Yeah, run. Yeah. Yep.
Don't pick someone familiar.
No. And don't try to, how do I put this? Don't try to become okay for them. Yeah. Yeah. So
I hope you feel like you learned as much as I did from that incredible conversation with Patrick. In the show notes, I'll link to how you find him, how you can potentially apply to be part of one of his support groups. And I want to remind you all, if you found value in this episode from the bottom of my heart for the good and the sustainability of this growing community, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Those reviews are so helpful to increasing our visibility to new audience members and also making us a more desirable partner for a potential sponsor, which can offset the cost of facilitating and producing this podcast. Also, if you haven't joined our community on Instagram, we are having amazing conversations there. This is Candy Kiss over at Instagram. And always, I love hearing from you. DM me with your thoughts, your concerns, your questions, your need for resources. I'm here for you. I love this community. It is helping me heal and grow. And I want every single one of us to blow out our birthday candles on our 60th birthday with as few of regrets as possible. Until next time, much love from me to you.